Is the era of identity politics finally over? We're going to find out on this episode of Not Suitable for Democracy. Welcome to Not Suitable for Democracy. My name is Nick Hobby, and I'm your host. Today we're going to be discussing identity politics and how a moderate Democrat can evolve into a progressive. And also, is the era of identity politics finally over? We're going to find out on today's episode. But first, thank you. Thank you so much for tuning in to the second episode of Not Suitable for Democracy. I had a lot of great feedback from the first episode, and I really appreciate the support. So if you'd like to message me about a topic that you want to see on the show, then make sure to reach out on Instagram. And you can find me at nsfd_pod. If you like what you hear and want to learn more, then make sure to subscribe to Not Suitable for Democracy on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. If you'd like to go for a deeper dive on my Substack, then make sure to find me at nsfdpod.substack.com. Okay, let's get into it. Identity politics. What is it? Where did it start? And where are we now? So, to put it briefly, identity politics refers to political movements, beliefs, and policies based on personal aspects of someone's identity, such as race, sex, gender, sexual orientation, religion, creed, ethnicity, and more. So, not only that, but when you think about each identity, there are sometimes instances where these identities intersect. For example, I'll use myself. My ethnicity is Latino, I identify as male, I am a man, and I'm gay. So, thinking about all those different identities, each of them will shape my perspective not only on life, but also my point of view. And that can be translated not only through my day-to-day, but even my politics. So identity politics really has taken shape not only through individual identities, but also intersectionality. Identity politics also centers itself around which voices are being uplifted, which policies and interests are being prioritized, and how are we sharing and listening to each other's experiences. Based on those three elements, that is how we can really understand and learn from each other, not only based on each other's identities, but even our experiences. How does that translate into policy? Well, identity politics was widely popularized in the 20th century, but it even has roots in the 1800s. The abolitionist movement. Abolitionists had gotten together, particularly Black Americans and their allies, to fight to end slavery. And ultimately, they organized around their values, believing that race-based policies are morally unjust. And thankfully, they succeeded in their efforts. I'll give you another example. The women's suffrage movement. Women in America weren't granted the right to vote until August 18th, 1920. Now, their initial efforts didn't start until 1878, so it took over 40 years before it finally became law. Now, while that organizing was very important, let's be clear. This is where intersectionality comes in. While women had the right to vote as of 1920, this didn't include all women. It primarily focused on white women. Black women, unfortunately, didn't have the right to vote until the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So, as you can see, identity politics is all about representation and power. Those two core elements are the real driving force. Now, with that said, we also see some issues with identity politics as a vehicle for change. I'll give you an example. Think about the Latino community. Our media does a really poor job of really separating or individualizing all the nationalities and groups that make up the Latino community. For example, we know that in the 2024 election, especially in the Florida area, Cuban Americans primarily supported Donald Trump, whereas Puerto Ricans, they supported VP Harris. Now, when the media talks about the Latino community, they generally combine all nationalities with Latino descent under the same umbrella. Unfortunately, it definitely erases the nuance between these individual Latino groups or individual nationalities, right, that really play a role in how politics are shaping their point of view, their experiences, and how they're even being uplifted or even heard. So basically, we don't want to treat each identity as a monolith with the assumption that they all have the same points of view, the same ideas, and the same experiences, because it's not necessarily always the case. I'll give you another example. I'll use specifically the LGBTQIA plus community. So in our community, we don't necessarily want to play the oppression Olympics. And what I mean by that is, yes, it's a bit facetious, but what we see happening is that different identity groups and the intersectionality of each group will also be at odds at one another, particularly when trying to fight for and advocate for their rights or policies that support their individual identity versus community. So, for example, when we see LGBTQIA, an umbrella term for the queer, gay, trans, lesbian, bi, and so forth community, we start to see how different identity groups may prioritize some policies over others. Same sex marriage, for instance. While that did grant same sex couples the right to legally marry, trans folks, non binary folks, some folks may not have been prioritized in the fight for equality. So while same sex couples fought for equality, we saw it transpire into same sex marriage. Now, those who may not be married may not necessarily benefit from that policy. So, if we're fighting for equality and it's only being translated into one type of policy, same sex marriage, then how can we ensure that equality is fought for every member of the LGBTQIA community? So, that is to say, we still have a lot of work to do, and we've definitely made progress. So, identity politics can be a very powerful vehicle for change, and especially for organizing. This allows us to organize around these core tenets, these core values, and essentially come together to fight and advocate for the change these groups deserve. And now, my Hillary to Bernie journey. This is to show how I evolved from a moderate Democrat into a progressive, using identity politics. So, just to paint the picture, my journey began in 2016. I was 28 years old, openly gay, out living in Astoria in New York City, and I was very excited to elect the first woman president. As an openly gay man, I truly felt she would be the best for advocating for equality and fighting for gay rights. So, because I felt she would be the most qualified candidate for that, I really felt that supporting her campaign was the best path forward for me. So, in 2016, she lost the election. Didn't turn out the way I'd hoped. So then, charting a new path forward, in 2017, I got more involved in Democratic politics. But more importantly, I was having more conversations with my friends, particularly my friends who were progressive. They supported Bernie Sanders, they supported progressive policies, so I was learning about them. Wasn't on board, wasn't fully supportive, but it planted the seed, and that was key. Having those conversations with people I didn't necessarily agree with, but also valued in my life, really showed me that there are other ways of organizing and are other ways of, fighting for policies that work best for you. So then, also mind you, in 2017, we also saw the rise of the Me Too movement. That was also going on in the backdrop of all of this. So now moving to 2018, that's where everything changed. It was the New York Democratic primary for New York 14th Congressional District. At the time, Joe Crowley was running for re-election, and his primary challenger was Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. I was living in New York 14, and I was supporting Joe Crowley's campaign. Volunteering, phone banking, right? So it was very much a moderate Democrat who was in support of his leadership, thinking that was the best path forward. So, long story short, I had a negative encounter during a Q&A with Joe Crowley. I'm going to share this story more in depth at a later time, but for the sake of this argument, right, his answer didn't sit well with me in the sense that it really lacked a clear understanding of identity politics, especially under the backdrop of supporting women, women of color, all within the Democratic Party. Now, mind you, folks usually are able to understand that diversity is one of the core tenets or the backbone of the Democratic Party. So the fact that the soon to be leader of the Democratic Party was not even understanding the importance of identity politics at a very basic level, that just shook me in ways I just had no idea were even imaginable. Basically, his answer just cut through to my core, specifically through my core values. And that rift totally broke any sense of trust that I had with the Democratic Party and moderate politics. The moderate way of doing things was just the only world I understood and could make sense of. But after that moment, it just broke the facade, and I really had a hard time grappling the best path forward. Because of that breach in trust, I couldn't, in good faith, continue to support his campaign. So from that point on, I was talking to friends, I told them about the experience, and long story short, I really understood how progressive politics works so differently, but also, as someone who originally wanted to support the first woman president, I knew that supporting women was a core value, especially under identity politics. So if I could support Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, a woman of color, working class background, also a self-identified democratic socialist, I knew that I could be lending my voice to someone who I felt truly deserved the opportunity to lead in Congress. So with that said, lo and behold, history showed that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez won that Democratic primary in a landslide election. Not only did she out-organize everyone else, but obviously with her political savvy, her sharp communication, and her overall message just truly resonated with the district. And I was just so proud to have stood on my ground with my values. I didn't have to sacrifice my values. I stood firm in them and just realigned how I viewed not only democratic politics, but even my own view of the world. So, with all of that said, I still continue to support progressive policies and organize in progressive politics. And at the end of the day, this path forward has been my truest sense of self because this allows me to be more authentic, to really uplift others who deserve to be heard, and also just continue great organizing work that I find even more rewarding. So, just to recap, transforming from a moderate into a progressive was not an overnight journey. This took a series of many events to happen. It was really over the course of, some could argue, 2 years, or maybe even several years long before that. And to arrive at that point in 2018, let's just recap the key aspects of how I changed my mind. So first, my friends planted the seed. They were able to show me progressive politics. I never even heard of the Young Turks before them. I had no idea that progressive policies were even possible. So just first learning about it. So having the conversations, continuously learning about what was going on, but then also just planting the seed. It was in the back of my mind, didn't always support progressive politics, but I knew it existed. And then two, the breach of trust. Because the bonds of trust were broken just so severely, it just shattered my perception of the Democratic Party so much that I had like a visceral reaction. It was just so tough to navigate, what I thought was right, what I thought was correct, what I thought was morally good, just turned out to be so 180. And because of that, I really had to just question myself, the path forward, and that reckoning doesn't happen to everyone. And for me, it just was super intense because it really did cut into my core values. So, should someone else experience that, I would hope that they definitely talk about it with friends and family. They talk about it with maybe a third party in the sense of someone who is not in on the situation, just to get like an unbiased opinion. But also give yourself grace. Like I remember that weekend it happened. I had to really just, take it easy the rest of the night. Not go out, just kind of stay to myself and really think through what what that all meant. So having that breach of trust, but also giving yourself the time to grapple with it, right? How do you, now that it's broken, how do you build up the pieces, right? Think of all that for like the second element. And then lastly, right, the alternate solution. The fact that I was supporting a moderate Democrat, you know, and I wasn't pleased with what I saw or heard, what's the alternative? Well, fortunately, there was an awesome alternative, and that was AOC's campaign. So, because I knew I could realign my values, but also support an amazing organizer who really understood the lay of the land and especially just the needs of the community, it just made me feel so confident that I made the right choice. Even, and to be honest, even before election night, I did not think she was going to win just because, again, at the time of our politics, having a progressive one who was outspent, who was running on progressive policies, it wasn't heard of that this type of campaign could win. I did not think she would win. Doesn't mean I didn't believe in her, but it really meant just based on like the typical playbook, which is what I was so rooted in. I just felt like, you know what? She might not win, but I'm still going to support because that's what I truly believe. And lo and behold, she won. So, with that said, I think that landslide of victory also reaffirmed that I made the right choice. And it really showed that I wasn't alone in that decision. Many other people felt the same way. And I think having the ability to share my story, which I will definitely share more in depth at a later time, it just made the entire experience all the worthwhile, good and the bad. So, with that said, right, what is the next step? What is the next path forward? Well, after 2018, AOC won the general election and she became the youngest woman to ever represent a district in Congress. So, amazing work, right? And from then, my friends were asking, like, are you going to continue supporting progressive politics? Was this a one time thing? Are you going to support Bernie Sanders? And I was like, honestly, yeah, absolutely. Not only were progressives a part of that campaign, they were just so welcoming, so supportive, so warm. And progressives may get a bad reputation where if they're so aggressive in calling out, people who are antagonizing them or calling out moderate Democrats who are gaslighting them, right? It's hard to sit back and just let them do that or, let moderate Democrats gaslight us like that. Because at the end of the day, it really does hurt everyday Americans. But at the end of the day, progressives were just so sweet, kind, generous, and those were qualities that reaffirmed that this is where I belong. This progressive movement is welcoming to anybody, and it's not like drinking the Kool-Aid. And like, hey, people come and go, right? People may think they understand, and then they kind of get scared because it might not be politically popular. But if you stay with it and you really start to learn, how there are structural inequities that are currently existing that maybe moderate Democrats aren't prioritizing fixing, whereas progressives are certainly calling it out. I think if we start having these conversations, right, we can truly make a difference and bring more people into the fold. So when 2020 came around, I was so ready to support Bernie Sanders as the next president of the United States. I felt like he would be the best candidate for LGBTQI plus rights, even more than a candidate like Pete Buttigieg. And again, Pete Buttigieg may be openly gay, but I knew his policies and his background wouldn't necessarily be the best for me. I felt Bernie Sanders was, because his policies were more intersectional. And to be frank, when you hear about policies like Medicare for all, it wouldn't matter what race, gender, sex you are, because having access to healthcare completely changes the game, and everybody can support that because everyone would benefit from it. So, with that said, I think intersectional policy is important, identity politics is important, but really thinking about how we navigate or bring more people into the fold is going to be key, especially when pushing back against where we are today in President Trump's second term. Speaking of Trump, where do we find ourselves with identity politics now that President Trump has made such an effort to erase the history and existence of so many different identities, not only within the government, but also in policy? So, personally, I believe identity politics is here to stay, regardless of where we are in our political climate. Identity politics has been such a force for good and for change that I think it has so much power that we can continue to use it. However, I mentioned some of the critiques before about treating folks like monoliths, instead of competing, finding common ground amongst identities, but also making sure folks feel included rather than excluded. So I believe that with our new path forward, we need to re-examine how we layer our identity politics, but also find more commonalities and find different values to unify around. While it's one thing to use our identities to be the anchor, it does lead to a more superficial analysis of not only our organizing, but even our politics, right? If we're going to just, support each other based on, what we look like, our skin color, or our gender, or our sexuality, those things aren't necessarily going to put food on the table. They're not necessarily going to give us access to healthcare. They're not necessarily going to put a roof above our heads, right? They're not necessarily going to even provide economic opportunities. So, what I'm trying to get at is, while the era of identity politics is far from over, we are entering a new era of identity politics that must include a level of class consciousness. What I mean by that, like I kind of referenced earlier, is that if we can focus on the economic means through making sure that people are fed, people have housing, people have a great education, people have job opportunities, we can do all of that by taking a more intersectional approach to how we message, but also reaffirming that everyone is guaranteed economic prosperity. That very much falls in line with the pursuit of happiness. So, if we're able to unify around economic prosperity and how that can be woven through our politics, that is the best path forward. Now, mind you, this is against the backdrop of Trump's second presidency, where at his inauguration, he had billionaires, tons of billionaires, not only present at the inauguration, but even more in his cabinet. So the fact that his cabinet is made up of some of the richest people in the world just goes to show that there is a huge wealth problem, wealth inequality. I strongly believe it is absolutely unfair and unjust for one person to have more than $1 billion while people are starving, people are losing access to healthcare, people are dying, right? This is pretty severe, and maybe we don't hear all these stories on the news, but I know in so many communities across the country, people are really having a hard time just surviving. And we need to make sure everybody is thriving. So I strongly believe if identity politics ever wants to be effective in organizing more powerfully moving forward, especially in the Trump era as he tries to erase a lot of the existence of these identities, then we must include an economic message. And we can see success in that right now. At the timing of this recording, both Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez are touring the country with their Fight the Oligarchy tour. And just to give you an example, I'm wearing a T-shirt that Bernie Sanders, which is the image of Bernie Sanders coming to Queensbridge in Long Island City back during the 2020 presidential election. And there were about 26,000 people in attendance. And I'll never forget having the opportunity to stand there and just watch a lot of the great speakers share their message of a new vision for America, and then even Bernie's just great, powerful speech. And it just really just inspired me so much. And having been there, I know what that feeling of just being inspired and fighting for something greater is really all about. So I share this because AOC and Bernie, they just did a rally in Los Angeles. Do you want to know how many people showed up? Over 36,000 people. That's insane. Huge number. And just the idea that that many people came out to support on like a Saturday morning just goes to show that the Fight the Oligarchy, that message is resonating. People support, people believe, and we need to be able to create that change. If we can get people off the couch and to the polls, then we have a real chance of changing electoral politics for our future. So I would love for you to join me in fighting the oligarchy, taxing the rich, and really thinking about the economic prosperity message that needs to be included in our identity politics in order to truly make a difference in the direction of our country. And that's our show. Thank you so much for tuning in. I truly appreciate your support. If you like what you heard and want to learn more, then make sure to subscribe to Not Suitable for Democracy on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. If you'd like to learn more and go for a deep dive, then check out my Substack at nsfdpod.substack.com. And if you'd like to message me about comments on the show, or just want to ask a question, or hear about topics for a later episode, then make sure to follow me on Instagram at nsfd_pod. Thank you so much for joining. Tune in next week, and until then, remember, democracy is not suitable without you.